Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. If you are a returning subscriber, welcome back my feline friends. If you are new here, my name is Brandy and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. This week's case is sort of a mystery. I know I've been doing a lot of mysteries lately, but it intrigued me. This case was a suggestion by Matthew, so thank you, Matthew, for this suggestion. A night of partying leads to tragedy and a lot more questions than answers. So, let's get started. Arnold Archambeau was 20 years old and Ruby Bruguier was 19 years old. They lived in Lake Andes, South Dakota. Now, Lake Andes is a small town of about around 1,500 people. It's very rural, so when young kids want to go out and do something, there's very little to do. Now, Arnold and Ruby were both of the Yankton Sioux Native Americans. These two lovebirds met in high school and their relationship continued after they graduated. In 1991, they welcomed a daughter, Erica. So on December 11th, 1992, Arnold and Ruby, along with Ruby's 17-year-old cousin, Tracy, had gone out partying. Again, there's not much to do, so they may drive around and drink alcohol or go to parties. Now, these three stayed out all night, partying and drinking lots of alcohol, so all three of them were very drunk. About 6 a.m. on December 12th, Arnold, Ruby, and Tracy would show up at Tracy's father's house. Now, Tracy's father was actually watching Arnold and Ruby's baby Erica while they went out and had a good time. They showed up at 6 a.m. to pick up their daughter to go home. However, Tracy's father saw that they were all three very inebriated and didn't think that it was safe for the baby to go with them in their current state. So he told him that they needed to go home and sleep it off and then come back when they were sober. The couple agreed and they ended up leaving the house. Now, Tracy, instead of staying home, for whatever reason, decided to go with Arnold and Ruby as well. So they left Tracy's father's house and came up to a stop sign. After they took off from that stop sign, they got into a horrible traffic accident. Arnold was driving the car and they ended up in the ditch upside down. Now, either somebody saw the crash and called the authorities, or authorities just happened upon the crash, but the paramedics did arrive not too long after the crash, and they were able to get Tracy, who was stuck in the back seat, out of the car. But Tracy was the only one in the car at the time. So once they were able to get Tracy out, they asked her exactly what was going on. Tracy would state that she was with her cousin Ruby and Ruby's boyfriend Arnold. She stated that the car suddenly just careened into the ditch, like Arnold either hit black ice or just wasn't paying attention to where he was going. And she also admitted that all three had been drinking and were very drunk. Tracy stated that once the car was flipped on its top and she kind of came to and assessed the situation, she stated that Arnold was not in the car. He was gone, but Ruby was in the car. She then said that Ruby got out of the car and just took off without attempting to save her. So here's her actual quote. "We came up to the stop sign. That's all I remember is just him, Arnold, looking and saying there are no other cars, and him spinning out from the stop sign. And it was just like a snap of a finger, and then the next thing you know, we ended up in the ditch. I was upside down in the ditch, and Ruby and I were in the car. Arnold wasn't in the car. I don't know where he was. Ruby was crying. she was saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." She just kept hitting the car, like in frustration. The next thing I know, the door, it was a little ways open, and Ruby had enough room where she just slid out. And so then I was going to reach over, and then it was just like that. The door shut, unquote. And Tracy was trapped until paramedics got there and saved her life. See, this is South Dakota in the dead of winter in December, and that day, or that morning, it was about 26 degrees. Now, authorities took note that the road was icy that night, and Arnold could have just hit black ice and spun out, especially in his drunken state. Tracy also said that after Ruby had left the car, that she heard nothing. She never heard them talking. She never heard them arguing, that she heard nothing until she heard the paramedics arrive. Now, authorities would start looking around the area, walking up and down the ditch, which of course was full of snow at the time, and there was some water in the ditch that had frozen over. So they were checking the ice and removing the snow, walking up and down the ditch. They even checked a nearby railroad, and a nearby lake that was frozen over as well, looking for any breaks in the ice. But that night that they searched, they did not find Arnold or Ruby at all. Now, for the next several days and weeks, the authorities, along with other departments and the community, even came out and walked the ditch and, searched for Ruby and Arnold. This would go on until about the end of January, and then it was determined that maybe Ruby and Arnold had fled the scene out of fear because they were drunk, they were both underage, and the DWI laws in South Dakota for being underage are pretty harsh. So they figured that they would show up eventually. Arnold and Tracy's families would disagree with this, saying that in their drunken state they could see them fleeing to avoid penalties, but for them to not come back for their daughter and to just leave Tracy in the car to potentially die is not like them at all. And so their family was very concerned. So for the next couple months after that, the police asked for leads from the community. They were very far and few between and didn't amount to much. And all they had was Tracy's witness statements. Now, in early March of 1993, about 5 months after the crash, a passing driver called authorities and reported that he saw a body in a ditch. The authorities arrived at the location and found the body. Now, it was pretty decomposed, like it had been out in the elements for some time, and it was frozen to the ground. The body was actually unrecognizable by sight, and it wasn't until they found a tattoo and was able to determine by that tattoo that the body was actually Ruby. Now, Ruby's glasses and shoes were gone. They were nowhere around her, but her clothes were intact. Like, nobody took off her clothes and dressed her or anything like that. She was in the same clothes that she was wearing the night of the crash. Now, here's the weird part about this. The location where Ruby's body was found was a mere 75 feet away from where the initial crash took place back in December. Now, due to the snow melt, the ditch was filling up with more water, and in order to properly investigate where Ruby was found, the authorities decided to pump out the water in the ditch. So they started doing that the next day, and to their horror, they found another body that was submerged in the water. And it ended up being Arnold. Now, Arnold's body was not as decomposed as Ruby's, and he was able to be identified by sight. His skin tone was typical of somebody immersed in cold water, and he was not frozen to the ground. Now, authorities were not able to determine if the clothes he was wearing were the same clothes that he was wearing the night of the crash, because nobody seemed to remember what Arnold was wearing that December night. So now here we have two bodies just feet away from the initial crash, and it appears that they had been there maybe all along, but this is impossible according to authorities. Now, autopsies would be performed on Arnold and Ruby, and it was determined that their cause of death was exposure, that they froze to death. But the time of the death could not be determined, and this was mainly because Ruby's body was so decomposed and Arnold's body was being submerged in water. One deputy would go on to state that Arnold and Ruby may have died of exposure, but they did not die of exposure in that ditch. So as authorities began investigating this strange occurrence, they were finding strange clues in and around the ditch. There was a tuft of hair that was found on kind of the side of the road on top of the ditch, and it was determined to be Ruby's hair. But the authorities stated there's no way this tuft of hair that was just caught on some weeds could have been there since December. There was also a set of keys found in Arnold's pockets. There were 3 keys on the key ring, and one was to a car and the other 2 was to like a house or an apartment or a residence. But the problem was they weren't able to determine what the keys went to. The car keys did not go to the car that Arnold was driving that night. The house or residence keys didn't belong to where Arnold or Ruby lived either, or any of their families. So that was baffling as well. To make things more confusing, a witness came forward. She went to high school with Arnold, and she stated that she saw Arnold on New Year's Eve at a party. Now, this would have been 3 weeks after the crash took place. Now, they ended up giving this witness a polygraph test because they needed to be sure, and she passed it. She said that there were 3 other people with Arnold at the party, and she named these individuals. These individuals were tracked down and questioned. Now, all 3 of them said they had no idea what this witness was talking about, and they were not with Arnold. Now, they were given polygraph tests as well, just to be sure, and all 3 of them failed the polygraph test. Of course, rumors and everything else started swarming this small community. Ruby's father stated that he believed that Ruby and Arnold were, in a sense, kidnapped, killed elsewhere, and then brought back and dumped in the ditch. The main investigator in charge of this case was adamant that those bodies were not in that ditch from December to at least the end of January. He said many different departments and community members and other authorities, including himself, had walked that ditch several times between the time of the crash and the end of January, and those bodies were not there. And there's sworn affidavits and statements all over this as well. So this case was pretty much a mystery for a very, very long time, and still is. Now, years later, it was reported that 2 men were seen by the ditch hours before Arnold and Ruby's bodies were found. And it was reported that they were driving a dark Blazer type vehicle, but these men have never been found or identified. This case would air on Unsolved Mysteries in April of 1995 in order to see if anyone out there could give any more information and a clue to what happened to Arnold and Ruby. And the case was still considered unresolved until 1999. Now, the FBI actually officially closed this case in 1999, stating that they have found no solid evidence of foul play, and that Ruby and Arnold did die accidentally of exposure. However, there are some local authorities and Ruby and Arnold's family do believe that there is some foul play involved here, because they refuse to believe that Ruby and Arnold were in that ditch the night of the crash until March. It just is impossible. As for the keys that were found on Arnold, one deputy would hang on to these keys for years after the case. He would try them in every lock he came across, but he was never able to determine what they went to. Arnold and Ruby's daughter Erica would be raised by her family, but unfortunately she was so young at the time of her parents' death that she doesn't really remember them. Now, the inconsistencies between Arnold and Ruby's bodies of decomposition can easily be explained because Ruby seemed to be out in the elements as Arnold was submerged under the water. And being submerged under cold water, of course, will slow decomposition very much. But the bigger question in all of this, if the bodies were there the night of the crash, why weren't they found? The ditch was searched thoroughly by many, many people. It'd be impossible to miss 2 bodies, just mere feet from where the crash happened, even if they were buried in the snow. So let's just speculate that Arnold and Ruby were afraid that they were going to get in trouble for being underage and drinking, so they buried themselves in the snow to hide from the authorities that came upon the scene. And we know at least Ruby was alive according to Tracy's witness statement as she crawled out of the car. And we know that when this happened, it was about 26 degrees with a lot of snow and some ice in the ditch. So let's say they buried themselves in the snow to hide from the authorities. Do you think that they would have been there so long and not be found that they died of exposure? And if they did, why weren't they found in the subsequent searches that went on after the crash? It just doesn't make any sense. Now, some others have speculated that the authorities really didn't search the ditch, that they just figured Arnold and Ruby fled the scene and that they would just appear later, and that they lied about searching the ditch so thoroughly because when the bodies were found in March, boy, they'd have a lot of public scrutiny on their back, wouldn't they? And that this was just a whole big cover-up. However, there are many people that stated that they searched that ditch, and it's not just 1 or 2 people or a department. It was many departments, even community members that wanted to help out. So unless everyone involved in this is part of the conspiracy, I find it highly unlikely that it's a cover-up. So what are your thoughts on this mystery? Do you think Arnold and Ruby were taken and died elsewhere and brought back? I mean, a lot of people stated that maybe like a psycho or a serial killer came upon them, kidnapped them, killed them, and brought them back. But what doesn't make sense is the autopsy stated that they died of exposure. So that kind of rules out a serial killer, because we all know serial killers like to usually torture their victims. So they weren't stabbed, they weren't shot, they weren't tortured. Okay, so what if some psycho came and kidnapped them, made them die of exposure in his own backyard, and then brought them back? I guess anything is possible. It's just, this case is so weird. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button. And we will be back next Friday with another true crime case or mystery. I will do a true crime case next Friday. I think we've done enough mysteries for a while. So I will see you next Friday, guys. Thanks for joining. I really appreciate you guys. Bye.